Good morning, all. The subcommittee will come to order. We're meeting today to consider H.R. 3432, the Safer Pipelines Act of 2019, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. This morning we will be marking up H.R. 3432, the Safer Pipelines Act of 2019, a bill I introduced earlier this week. As Chairman Pallone and I stated at last week's hearing on the discussion draft, we want to work with the minority side on this bill, and we will continue to do so even as we move forward between today's subcommittee markup and the full committee markup. To be clear, the introduced bill before us today still represents a work in progress, and we will continue to negotiate in good faith with the minority side to finalize what I hope will be a bipartisan, what we all hope will be a bipartisan bill that will eventually become law. The issue of pipeline safety is not a Democratic or Republican issue, and these pipelines don't respect partisan lines and boundaries. They traverse every district in the nation, and they ultimately impact every American citizen. So it's extremely important that we get this right today, going into the future, and that we put forth a bill that protects the lives and the livelihoods of all of our citizens, as well as minimize the risk to our environment. As a show of good faith, we have agreed to strike sections from the discussion draft that were high priorities for myself, for Chairman Pallone, and many of our Democratic members. We've already ceded to the desires of the minority. Among these changes include deleting the section expanding the definition of regulated gathering lines, including all onshore gathering lines operating under a specified pressure. We also agreed to the minority side's request to strike the language regarding the grandfather clause, which exempts pipelines built before 1970 from having to test for the maximum allowable operating pressure. In addition, we also agreed to make changes to the section on the risk analysis and integrity management programs. Instead of phasing out direct assessment entirely, in the current bill, PHMSA will be required to issue regulations that prioritize accessing transmission pipelines in a way that will provide a greater level of safety than direct assessments. This current draft also requires a report on methods of assessing distribution pipelines other than direct assessment to determine whether any such methods are feasible and will provide an equal or greater level of safety. Additionally, each operator of a transmission pipeline facility in a high consequence area will be required to install automatic or remote shutoff valves based on risk assessment and as appropriate, no later than 2 years after the enactment of the bill, unless PHMSA will finalize the regulation on automatic or remote shutoff valves as current law already mandates. While each of these provisions are important to many members of the majority party, we have agreed to take into account the concerns of our Republican colleagues so that we may move forward working together as we have done so on this issue in the past. And I want to just say that we are looking forward to working with our Republican colleagues on this bill in order to get a bipartisan bill. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time and would like to recognize Ranking Member Upton for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, my friend. Today we are marking up H.R. 3432, the Safer Pipelines Act of 2019. As I expressed at the legislative hearing last week, I was concerned that we were moving a little bit too fast, but I want to compliment you and your staff because we've made some very constructive improvements since last week. So I want to thank you for that good faith and willingness to include our side in the process. We still have work to do before we get to full committee, and we're ready to go to work. So my priorities for pipeline safety reauthorization are pretty straightforward. We got to ensure that PHMSA and the states have the resources that they need to perform their pipeline safety responsibilities. Second, we need to make sure that PHMSA completes the overdue hazardous liquid and gas pipeline rulemaking. Third, we want to make sure that PHMSA, state regulators, and pipeline operators are incorporating lessons learned from prior accidents, integrating new technologies, and continuing to improve safety. I'm afraid that some of the provisions of this bill will slow things down and weaken their ability, PHMSA's ability to monitor pipeline safety programs. Removing the requirements that PHMSA examine the full costs and benefits of proposed regs could delay the completion of important safety regulations. Authorizing frivolous lawsuits through a new mandamus clause would certainly bog down the process further, potentially resulting in sue and settle agreements that shut out the public and divert agency resources. Neither of these, I don't think, would be a very good outcome, and for those reasons, Republicans have filed amendments to improve the bill. I'm also concerned that H.R. 3432 would undo the progress that PHMSA has been making over the last couple years on new regs for both gas and liquid pipelines. Since everyone seems to agree that PHMSA should complete its outstanding congressional mandates and pending regs, we should examine whether new legislative mandates regarding direct assessments or automated valves will conflict with the regulations that are nearing completion. We should also examine the language regarding civil penalties and public outreach more thoroughly to eliminate the potential for unintended consequences and to make sure that we're incentivizing a culture of safety. So those are some of the things we got to look at before we get to a full committee markup. Finally, we need to think about how to encourage PHMSA and pipeline operators to implement lessons learned from prior accidents, integrate new technologies, and continue to improve safety. We ought to include some amendments perhaps to establish a pilot program for technology and a volunteer information sharing system. We also should examine ways to protect pipelines from physical and cyber attacks, very important, to ensure the reliability of our energy systems. With that, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership, the good staff work that really did take place over the last number of days, and I look forward to continuing to work with you closely in the weeks ahead. With that, I yield back.
I want to thank the gentleman for his remarks. And now the chair recognizes Mr. Pallone, the chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Rush. Thanks for your leadership in introducing H.R. 3432, the Safer Pipelines Act of 2019. This legislation takes crucial steps in ensuring that the more than 3 million miles of pipeline transporting oil and gas throughout the nation are safe. H.R. 3432 reauthorizes the Department of Transportation's pipeline safety program at a workable level, including funding for grants to local responders and to communities for technical assistance. It also makes several important improvements to the federal pipeline safety program. First, it removes the duplicative and rigged cost-benefit analysis from current law, while still ensuring PHMSA rules are subject to the same economic analysis that every other major rule receives. The bill also restores the mechanism for citizens to pursue legal action to compel PHMSA to fulfill its statutory duties. And this is a critically important tool for communities because too often PHMSA doesn't do its job. And we must find a way to get PHMSA to carry out its responsibilities because the alternative is a danger to life, property, and the environment. H.R. 3432 also fixes the ridiculously high bar for imposing criminal penalties in current law. The bill changes the standard to knowingly or recklessly, which would bring the pipeline criminal standard in line with that of the hazmat statute. The government must be able to hold companies accountable when they knowingly or recklessly ignore the law. The bill also increases fines that can be imposed on bad actors and removes the overall cap on penalties. Mr. Rush's legislation also takes important steps to improve pipeline safety by providing communities with greater access to more useful information about the pipelines that run through their neighborhoods. It also boosts the use of smart pigs and other technologies and ensures that pipeline operators will have to install remote or automatic valves on their lines where appropriate. We must do everything in our power to ensure our national pipeline network is as safe as possible, and the ideas included in the Safer Pipelines Act are, in my view, critical to achieving that end. From the beginning of this process, I have said this bill is a starting point for discussion and collaboration. At last week's legislative hearing, my Republican colleagues raised concerns over several matters in the discussion draft. Since that time, Chairman Rush and I have taken steps to begin addressing these concerns so that we can move towards a bipartisan committee product. First, we have set aside two issues flagged by Republicans during our legislative hearing. That's the regulation of gathering lines and elimination of the grandfather clause that allows pre-1970 pipelines to remain untested for maximum allowable operating pressure. While we have dropped them from the bill as introduced, these issues are still very important, and I hope that we can find a bipartisan solution to address them. And we have also set aside a direct requirement for operators to install leak detections on their lines. Also, in response to Republican concerns, we have significantly modified two other key components of the bill. First, the bill no longer eliminates direct assessment as a method for assessing pipeline integrity. Instead, it requires PHMSA to issue a rule to assess technologies such as internal inspection devices, robots, and hydrostatic testing, and to prioritize their use over direct assessment on transmission lines if they will provide a greater level of safety. With distribution lines, the bill would now have the Secretary study and report to Congress on the potential to use methods that would ensure a higher level of safety than direct assessment. The bill also limits the application of the mandate for operators to replace manual valves with remote control or automatic valves. First, it makes clear that a hazardous liquid pipeline would not be required to install an automatic shutoff valve that could cause a rupture. And second, the mandate on operators to install these valves would now only go into effect if PHMSA fails to publish within 2 years the rule on these valves it was required to produce by the 2011 Act. So we have made these changes to show good faith that our intent is to report a strong bipartisan bill. And I recognize that we aren't there yet, but we're marking up in the subcommittee today in the hope that we can reach an agreement and report a bipartisan product out of full committee before we leave for the August recess. And I would like the staff on both sides to spend the next few weeks working to achieve that goal. And I commit to bring PHMSA into the conversation further and try to ensure that member offices can question the regulators about the legislation. So again, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I look forward to working in a bipartisan matter to update and improve this critical federal program so that we can produce a final bill that we can all be proud of. And you know, we have a deadline because of the authorization's expiration, I believe, in September or October. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
I want to thank the chairman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Morning, Mr. Chairman.
Morning.
The continued safe, reliable, environmentally sound operation of our nation's 2.6 million miles of pipelines is essential for our economy and obviously for our communities. Pipelines provide the energy and resources for many goods and services in our daily lives, whether it's the power for transportation, the heat and cooling for our homes and businesses, the electricity for lights, and so much more. Our responsibility is to make sure the federal government, especially the states, have appropriate resources and tools to develop and enforce pipeline safety requirements for this critical system. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, this committee's work to reauthorize the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, and to modernize the nation's pipeline safety program has long been done in a strong bipartisan manner. Unfortunately, as our side has expressed at our legislative hearing last week, we've not really been following that practice this year. The original draft version of the bill we're marking up today, introduced just 2 weeks ago, underscored our concerns about moving too fast. It lacked any input from the minority, which several members on our side expressed last week. Having said that, and while we still have concerns about several of the provisions in the bill we're marking up today, I want to recognize that our committee staff have started to sit down and work through these various issues, and I'm appreciative of that. This is an encouraging start, which I hope will continue past today as we seek to find mutually agreeable ways to improve our nation's pipeline safety. This should not be a partisan exercise. So today's markup represents a good chance to outline some of the improvements we think are necessary in the bill. For example, we should focus on opportunities to improve pipeline safety through innovation and technology. Let's look at what we can do to encourage pipeline operators to continue innovating and incorporating the most cutting-edge technologies and best practices. Let's provide the tools and incentives so that our regulations can keep pace with best practices. And part of this may involve simply incentivizing the completion of current rulemakings and not piling on more congressional mandates or counterproductive requirements. So let's explore the concept of a pilot program that would allow PHMSA to collaborate with pipeline operators to permit the use of new safety technologies and best practices. There seems to be strong support at the agency and among stakeholders for that concept. And the idea an information sharing program makes sense, modeled on safety programs used successfully in other federal agencies. So I think that would be worth close attention by this committee. Some of these ideas were discussed in the legislative hearing last week. They represent the kind of reforms we should continue to work on together. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your willingness to include us in the drafting process in the last few days and your commitment to continue that inclusiveness going forward. We appreciate it, and we're hopeful this type of cooperation will result in a strong bipartisan product we can all support before any full committee markup. With that, I yield back.
Well, the Chair, thanks to the ranking member. The Chair want to ask, is there any members who seek recognition?
Mr. Chair.
Make an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. The tone I hear here is very, very encouraging because I think the need for us to reauthorize the Federal Pipeline Safety Program is very timely and very urgent. And I like the bipartisan tone to kind of get to the finish line together with something that we can all be proud of. And I think that the concerns that we've been addressing, those of explosions, of attacks, and of accidents, speak to safety, and if we can prevent those or minimize them, obviously that should be our goal. But I would also add that we should take a look at leakage along methane leaks and environmental concerns that might be part of regulation that are part of pipeline safety should also be brought to this table as we approach it in a bipartisan spirited way. So I just want to get that concern expressed on the record. With that, I yield back.
Yeah. Mr. Tucker, I believe that that's your opening statement. Is that your opening statement rather than striking the last words? All right. Thank you. I just want to make sure that was correct. We were correct for the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Doyle. So we're going to go to this side. All right. Mr. Bouchard.
Mr. Chairman,
Recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word. The goals of this legislation should be to speed up PHMSA decisions and ensure focus on priority risks. Some of the provisions in the bill, however, run counter to this. For example, there is one provision, so-called mandamus requirements, that could slow the pace of PHMSA's rulemaking by encouraging frivolous lawsuits that result in sue and settle agreements, which in turn could divert agency resources from higher priority activity. I have filed an amendment to strike this provision so we can ensure timely PHMSA decisions on priority risks. I should note that this does not deprive people the right to sue if they are harmed. Also, as the agency noted in its technical comments, anybody adversely affected by PHMSA actions or failure to take action can seek judicial review. Therefore, the provision is unnecessary and will only slow down safety work. I believe we can do better. As we work through this process, it is my hope that we can work together to address defects like this and work towards a bipartisan agreement. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Let me be clear. We're in the phase of the hearing, of the markup rather, for opening statements, and we haven't called the bill up. So, Mr. Bouchon, I would ask that you use this time, or use the time that you've had for the for an opening statement rather than striking the last word.
Understood. Yeah, that was my opening statement, and I think that based on the committee, the commitment of the committee to work together, the amendment won't be offered during the amendment phase.
All right.
I yield back.
So now we are in still in the section of the hearing for opening statements, and the chair recognizes Mr. Mr. Kennedy for the purposes of an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be recognized. I would only speak on my amendment, so at this point I will yield back and speak on my amendment when it is time to offer an amendment.
But it says that I am.
Yield back.
Lana, you're recognized for an opening statement.
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Is that different than?
I'm sorry. But I appreciate the opportunity to make a quick opening statement. Recent technological advances in the energy sector have made it easier to access and transport domestic sources of energy. More than 2/3 of the energy consumed in the United States is transported through our country's systems of pipelines. Gaining access to these resources has resulted in positive economic growth in my home state and also the country at large. Because of the significance of these developments, it's crucial that we have a pipeline system in place that is safe, secure, and efficient in order to meet our nation's energy needs. In order to accomplish this, we should be pursuing legislation that will reauthorize the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, so we can actually complete this work. We should be embracing not restricting innovation in the private sector to meet safety standards in more efficient and effective ways. While some progress has been made on this bill, I hope that my colleagues on the other side will continue to work with us on our concerns, and I appreciate what's been done with committee staff at this time. One way we can improve this legislation is include regulatory flexibility to allow operators to incorporate new technologies and safety methods. And later I will be offering an amendment to do so. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any other member here who want to have an opening statement during this? I mean, motion to strike the last word during this opening statement portion of our markup. Is there any other? You want to do an opening statement, or you want to strike the last word? Opening statement?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson for the purposes of an opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned at last week's hearing, we all want to produce a bill that fully advances safety practices for our pipeline operators. Among other priorities, this means producing a bill that does not inhibit the successful integration of new technologies that can improve safety. It also means ensuring PHMSA and states have the resources and tools they need to successfully carry out their responsibilities. The legislation before us today is a significant improvement from the draft bill we discussed last week, and I thank the chairman for his recent work with us. But this bill still has a way to go, and it is my hope that we can continue this recent bipartisanship by addressing some of the key remaining issues in this bill before the full committee markup. For instance, I remain concerned about Section 3 of H.R. 3422. Removing PHMSA's cost-benefit requirement won't necessarily improve the speed of its rulemaking process. In fact, I worry that it will have just the opposite effect. As witnesses have recently testified before this committee, this analysis can help address technical feasibility concerns early in the rulemaking process, thereby negating any lengthy review issues when OMB performs its own analysis. Additionally, receiving input from other agencies and stakeholders only helps to provide for a rule that can best successfully address safety concerns and is cost effective. So, In an effort to generate further discussion on this concern, I filed an amendment today that strikes Section 3, but again, I remain hopeful that we can address this issue before the full committee markup, and I certainly stand ready to work on this issue with my friends in the majority. I yield back.
Members who seek time for an opening statement. All right. Seeing none on the Democratic side, Ms. McMorris-Rogers is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. We must work together in a bipartisan manner to ensure that our existing pipeline infrastructure is safe for the benefit of all Americans. And I'm glad the majority has been willing to address some of the concerns we raised during the legislative hearing last week. We've made progress from the initial discussion draft. However, there's still more work that needs to be done. When it comes to pipelines, this committee has been instrumental in developing a program that's increased the safety of the nation's pipeline system. And as we work towards additional improvements, we must be sure we are moving in the right direction to advance safety practices. We do not want to impose new requirements, rules, or penalties that have harmful consequences for pipeline safety. One provision that particularly concerns me is changing the legal standard for criminal actions from, quote, knowingly and willfully to knowing or recklessly. I filed an amendment to strike that provision. While that standard may be appropriate for other transportation modes, it's unclear if it is the best fit for pipeline operators, and we should vet this more carefully to avoid unintended consequences. PHMSA has raised concerns and pointed out that the current standard has allowed DOJ to successfully pursue pipeline safety-related prosecutions. The witnesses at our hearing last week also suggested that it could discourage pipeline operators from openly sharing information about incidences. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your commitment to improving pipeline safety, and I believe we should work together towards stronger safety systems. I hope that you'll work with me moving forward, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members who? The chair now recognizes Mr. O'Halloran for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Rush. I appreciate the intent of this revised bill draft to reauthorize critical pipeline safety protections for our public health and environment, while providing clear direction for our pipeline operators. April 27th, 2016 is the last time this subcommittee convened for a markup of a pipeline safety reauthorization bill. On that day, this very subcommittee moved that package forward by a voice vote. Weeks later, on June 2016, the full Energy and Commerce Committee moved our pipeline safety reauthorization forward as well, also by a voice vote. I will always strive to be a champion for bipartisanship, and beyond today's subcommittee markup, I remain hopeful that our final product is moved forward by our tradition of a consensus agreement between our majority and minority. I'm pleased to see this latest draft includes changes to provisions around the maximum allowable operating pressure testing and takes a fresh approach to direct assessment measures for operators and distributors. During last week's hearing, I was stunned at the agreement among our witnesses that PHMSA and state agencies continue to lack the funding resources necessary to properly train pipeline inspectors and fully carry out its mission. I hope our authorizing levels for PHMSA and the states will fully meet the needs of those who need it. I am cautious to provisions in this current draft stripping total caps on civil penalties and would urge our focus remain on structuring proactive safety measures and rigorous oversight over pipeline operators. Lastly, I would be open to the inclusion of a pipeline safety technology program, something PHMSA's technical experts included in their proposal to Congress, because I believe it would spur innovation and help bring critical safety technologies to our pipelines in a controlled, tried, and tested manner. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to continuing our pipeline reauthorization discussions, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members desiring an opening statement at this time? I believe that concludes our opening statements pursuant to committee rules. Members' written opening statements will be made part of the record. Please submit written statements to the clerk's office. And this time we will begin bill consideration. The chair calls up H.R. 3432, the Safer Pipelines Act of 2019. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3432, a bill to amend Title 49 United States Code to improve the safety of the nation's natural gas and hazardous liquid pipeline systems and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to offer a bipartisan amendment? Seeing none, are there any members who seek recognition to offer an amendment? For what purposes does Mr. Kennedy offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
For what purpose? Okay. All right, Ms. Kennedy, you're recognized for 5 minutes for the purpose of your amendment.
Clerk.
Read the title. Clerk, read the title.
Amendment to H.R. 3432 offered by Mr. Kennedy of Massachusetts. At the end of the bill, add the following, Section 11. Distribution.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dismissed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for calling up this bill and thank my colleagues for their attention to this amendment. Around 4 p.m. on the afternoon of September 13th in 2018, a series of explosions rocked the towns of Lawrence, Andover, North Andover, Massachusetts, resulting in damage to at least 131 different structures, dozens of injuries, evacuations of thousands of residents, and tragically, the death of a young man. For several months following the explosions, families were displaced from their homes or otherwise unable to use gas-fired utilities such as stoves and hot water heaters. Businesses were shuttered, and the entire community fought to regain any semblance of normalcy. That effort continues to this day, 9 months later. Merrimack Valley citizens, leaders, and representatives sought answers from subsequent investigations at both the state and national level. Last November, the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the incident was a result of a high-pressure natural gas system that was released into a low-pressure gas distribution system. In April, I joined my colleagues, Representatives Lori Trahan and Seth Moulton here in the House, and Senators Ed Markey and Elizabeth Warren in introducing the Lionel Rondon Pipeline Safety Act. My amendment would add the provisions of the Lionel Rondon Pipeline Safety Act to the Safer Pipelines Act before us today. The language is straightforward. It is intended to increase distribution pipeline safety standards while closing regulatory loopholes. It would require regulations to improve the risk management safety plans of pipeline operators, improve coordination between operators and first responders in the case of emergencies, and require professional engineers to sign off on significant system changes and ensure additional safety features are installed in order to avoid similar overpressurization events. Finally, it would significantly increase the civil penalties companies would be subjected to in case of violations. The requirements outlined in this amendment are directly tied to the results of the NTSB investigation, which made it abundantly clear what happened in Massachusetts could have been prevented with better oversight, tougher regulations, real accountability, and a more nimble response. 9 months have passed since the Merrimack Valley explosions, and Congress is required to reauthorize the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration by September 30th this year. We have an opportunity in this committee to ensure that no other community suffers as these Massachusetts cities and towns have, and at the very least, to put in place regulations to mitigate the consequences if and when another pipeline incident occurs. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the work of your work and the committee's work with me on this issue, and your commitment to including similar language in the bill that will hopefully reach the President's desk. Given those ongoing discussions, at this time, I will withdraw this amendment.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, Mr. Chair, to the ranking member, of course.
If the gentleman yield, I just want to confirm that we want to work with the gentleman from Massachusetts. This was a terrible incident. We all remember it well. Got headlines all over the country. We saw it. We are pushing PHMSA also to respond. As I understand, they're doing that with Senator Markey, former member of this committee. But we want to work with you, and we want to make sure that we include some provision here that is satisfactory and obviously helps the people not only in Massachusetts but around the country as well. And I just want to make that commitment. I appreciate the offer to withdraw the amendment so that we can spend just a little more time on it, get some PHMSA's input. But I just want to make that assurance before you withdraw. Yield back,
thank the ranking
yield back
member.
to the
Grateful.
gentleman from Massachusetts, my friend.
Grateful for the words, sir, and look forward to working with you and your colleagues to make sure we can get something across the finish line here. And Chairman, I'll yield back.
And the chairman also want to reiterate the intent of the staff and those on the outside to work with both Mr. Kennedy and you for an agreement on this and any other provision that might come forward. The gentleman withdraws his amendment.
Yes, I have. Withdraw the amendment.
Are there any other members who seek recognition to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Who seeks it? Mr. Wahlberg is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3432 offered by Mr. Wahlberg of Michigan. Insert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would help improve the underlying bill by authorizing a voluntary information sharing system to encourage collaboration among PHMSA and pipeline operators. As many in this room know, this committee's reauthorization effort in 2016 directed the Secretary to establish a working group of operators, technical experts, safety advocates, and others to consider the need for an information sharing system. After nearly 3 years of discussion and debate, that working group issued a favorable report and made several recommendations to Congress, including the following. Number one, Congress should authorize a voluntary information sharing system and direct PHMSA to establish a governance structure and technology platform. 2, Congress should enact legislation to provide confidentiality and liability protections to incentivize industry participation. And 3, Congress should ensure that the VIS program includes gas distribution system data, the program to significantly reduce industry incidents nationwide. On Monday, I sent a letter to Administrator Elliott highlighting the importance of this program and asked their willingness to work with us as we examine this program. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this letter and the working group's report into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. My amendment implements the VIS program according to the working group's recommendations. At our legislative hearing on the majority's discussion draft, witnesses testified that Congress should direct PHMSA to establish this program, provide PHMSA and operators robust protections for information sharing, and facilitate voluntary self-reporting. This framework could encourage more self-reporting, help operators self-police, and improve on their own processes, and reduce the instances of an event. But we must strike the right balance between voluntary sharing sensitive information and protection from liability and regulation, which could chill this mutually beneficial relationship. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any members who want to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, I recognize myself to speak on the amendment. I want to thank the gentleman for his interest in promoting pipeline safety through better information sharing. I do have a few concerns about this amendment, including what I view as the broad protections from liability and broad protections from for requests. I am open to discussing the issue with the gentleman ahead of the full committee markup to see if we can agree on provisions of this policy. Does the gentleman from Michigan wish to withdraw his amendment?
I thank the chairman. I'm prepared to withdraw this amendment per the chairman's commitment to work with me to perfect this amendment on the way to full committee markup, and I appreciate that, and with that, I will withdraw.
The gentleman withdraw his amendment, and is there any other member who seek Mr. Latta is recognized for?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk,
The clerk,
number 22.
Amendment to H.R. 3432, offered by Mr. Latta of Ohio. Add at the end of the following, Section 11, Pilot Program for Innovative Pipeline Safety Technology.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my amendment to H.R. 3432 would direct the Secretary of Transportation to establish a pilot program to evaluate innovative safety technologies and practice for the operation of a gas pipeline facility or hazardous liquid pipeline facility. In order to qualify for exemptions from regulations, the Secretary would require that the safety measures in the programs achieve a level of safety that is equivalent to or greater than the level of safety that would otherwise be achieved through compliance with the regulations. This amendment would provide flexibility to PHMSA to accomplish its safety mission and goals while also promoting new technologies and methods to improve pipeline safety. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
the chair, want to thank the gentleman. Are there any members who seek recognition for to speak on this amendment? Seeing none, then the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes on the gentleman's amendment. I want to thank the gentleman for an effort to promote innovation in pipeline safety technology. However, we cannot accept this amendment as drafted. I'm sure this was the gentleman's intent, but our reading of the amendment is that it gives the Secretary extremely broad exemption authority from existing regulations in safety technologies and practices. This amendment allows the Secretary to waive existing regulation in lieu of new safety technologies and practices. But the baseline standard of safety for these new safety technologies and practices would mean only that they are, quote, designed, end quote, to meet the equivalent level of safety as compliance with existing regulations. I would like to emphasize design. They do not even have the power to have to be proven to meet or exceed current safety regulations. I'm not sure how that drives innovation. Instead, this opens the opportunity for random and relatively arbitrary waivers from the Secretary from critical pipeline safety regulations. And so we'll have to oppose this amendment at this time. And the chair asks the gentleman from Ohio, do you wish to withdraw your amendment?
Well, Mr. Chairman, before I withdraw the amendment, is there any commitment that we could work with the majority on this?
The chairman have the absolute commitment.
With that, Mr. Chairman, with that commitment, I withdraw the amendment.
The chair thanks the gentleman, and the amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The chair, the gentleman's amendment will be read.
Amendment to H.R. 3432, offered by Mr. Flores of Texas. At the end of the bill, add the following Section 11, criminal penalties.
The amendment is considered as read. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, 5 minutes for the purpose of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Protest activities that kill or injure families or that damage the environment or hurt other people's property must never be tolerated. Unfortunately, several recent high-profile attacks demonstrated increased safety risk, and here are a few examples. The first, in October of 2016, anti-pipeline activists staged simultaneous attacks on 5 crude oil pipelines in 4 states along the U.S.-Canada border. These assailants targeted valve stations maintained by pipeline operators. These valves have important specific uses to stop the flow of product through the pipeline, such as isolating a pipeline segment during an emergency or to conduct maintenance. After breaking the chains and locks on perimeter fencing, assailants entered the facility grounds and turned valves, shutting off the flow of pipelines that together had a delivery capacity of 2.8 million barrels of crude oil a day, or around 15% of U.S. daily consumption. In 2017, assailants again attacked the same pipeline facility attacked in 2016 in Washington State. In 2019, assailants attacked another pipeline in northern Minnesota. Other assailants have admitted using acetylene torches to pierce holes in major pipelines under construction in Iowa and South Dakota, threatening a release if the pipeline went into service without repairs. The Pipeline Safety Trust said at the time of the valve turnings that closing valves on major pipelines can have unexpected consequences, endangering people and the environment. We do not support this type of action and think it is dangerous. Mr. Chairman, my amendment today would strengthen penalties against bad actors who are endangering lives and the environment by damaging pipelines, whether they are under construction or in operation. This provision is supported by PHMSA and was included in their reauthorization proposal. At last week's hearing, I asked our witnesses if they agreed that these vandalism attacks, including so-called valve turning, were dangerous. All 4 answered yes. Our witnesses also stated for the record that they would support or are open to supporting the strengthening of a criminal standard to discourage people from damaging pipelines in the future. Furthermore, 4 labor unions recently wrote to Chairman Rush and Leader Upton to support the closing of current loopholes in federal law to protect pipeline infrastructure from attacks. Some persons incredulously assert that vandalism is protected as free speech. In short, vandalism is not free speech. It is vandalism. It is a crime. If that crime hurts people, damages the environment, and damages property, it must be stopped. Mr. Chairman, this is an important issue, safety issue, and it can and should be fixed. Although I intend to withdraw my amendment today, it is my hope that the chairman will work with me on this provision before we mark up the bill at full committee. I yield back the balance of my time.
Back the balance of his time. Let me reassure Mr. Flores. You have the consistent and full commitment of the chairman and this side to work with you on your bill. Did the gentleman wish to withdraw his amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. With that commitment from you, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
So ordered. And now, any other amendments to the bill? The question, seeing no amendments, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 3432 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 3432 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill will be forwarded to the full committee. The chairman has before us unanimous consent request to be submitted for the record, a letter from the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, a letter from the Fiber Optic Sensors Association, and now, Chairman, recognize, I ask for unanimous consent to that the documents will be included in the record. Seeing no opposition, the documents will be included in the record. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bills consistent with the actions taken by the subcommittee today. And now the subcommittee now stands adjourned.
Good work.
Oh man.